Copper below $4, $3.98. Hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name is Adrian Pocobelli, and big moves in the financial markets. It's quite interesting. They're calling it the unwind of the Japanese yen carry trade, where, very briefly, because interest rates are dramatically lower in Japan, people would borrow in yen and then invest in, say, U.S. treasuries where they got a higher interest rate and then pay back the yen with a lower interest rate and pocket the difference. This is starting to become unwound because now, after declining pretty dramatically, the Japanese yen is starting to strengthen. And with that, all of a sudden the trade starts to fall apart because all of a sudden you have to pay back the yen that are more expensive and that are climbing dramatically, right? So that is happening there. I think it was a 12% drop in the market yesterday in the Japanese Nikkei stock market, and the S&P registering its worst day in 2 years. So it does feel blasé to a certain degree for such a dramatic turn of events. So let's see what happens. No predictions here on that. Interestingly, though, I would say from our mining perspective, we have been getting signals from the metals, particularly the industrial metals, in the last, let's call it 3 weeks, where they have been falling steadily and in unison. And it recalls actually James Dine's Wolfpack theory. And we're going to talk about James Dine's this episode with a legend in the business, Rick Rule of Rule Media, who just had their big conference in Boca Raton, Florida. We were just talking to Henry Lazenby about that a couple of weeks ago. So Rick Rule goes down memory lane in this summer episode here, I'm calling it, and he recalls his friendship with James Dines and what really James Dines meant for him and how he sees James Dines in the larger, investment community and really what he contributed. A fascinating interview here with Rick Rule on the legendary, now past, one of the great pioneers of newsletter writing, James Dines. You have to look wrong to be right. One of my favorite quotes from the great James Dines. Now, going back to the Wolfpack theory, another Dines concept, things moving in a pack, what we noticed with the metals in the last 3 weeks is they all seem to be moving in unison. And in retrospect, it's as if we could start to read into that. Because some weeks on this program, we see the metals move within their own narrative, we might say. And sometimes they move in unison. And when you see 3 weeks in a row like we did, it was significant. So my conclusion from this, the takeaway, is I think we should be quite aware. We should be looking for this when things start to move in unison. The metals, one could argue they anticipated the move to a certain degree, right? Again, copper below $4. Who would have expected that 2 months ago with copper at $5.18 and becoming one of the most popular trades in the entire investment sphere? So very interesting there. Now, going to Victoria Gold. So, of course, we've been following the heap leach pad failure incident in Yukon at the Eagle Mine. Victoria Gold is the company that runs the mine. We've had Nacho Nayuk Dun First Nation Chief Donna Hope on last week. She shared extreme concern on the lack of action on the part of the company as well as the government in regard to this ongoing contamination by the heap leach facility, seemingly, into the groundwater, which is now being registered and actually rising, as was feared and predicted. So John McConnell gave an interview with the CBC finally, 5 weeks after the incident, on July 30th. Incidentally, perhaps not incidentally, I'm not sure, on the same day that the Premier of Yukon gave a speech at the Council of Yukon's First Nations General Assembly. So both of these characters in this drama, Victoria Gold CEO John McConnell and Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai, showing up in Act 5, literally 5 weeks later of the play, and starting to say things after very little, according to Chief Hope, till the point of our interview a week and a half ago. Now, we can't go into the entire interview here. It is extended, but there are certain takeaways from the interview. And this is on CBC, and I'm just going to take a few snippets here. This is the CBC asking a question. We've heard from some Yukon officials who said it's been frustrating that Victoria Gold hasn't spoken publicly since the heap leach failure. Why are you choosing to speak now? John McConnell. Well, we've been heads down, tails up, working extremely hard and really haven't had time. I think we're starting to get things under control at the site and have some, I wouldn't say positive news, but some good news. So it's time to get out there and talk about it. But everybody's been working extremely hard. So the answer is we haven't had time to communicate because people are working too hard. Again, I've made it very clear my view on how important it is to communicate with the public on something as serious as massive amounts of heap leach solution leaking into the environment and seemingly, with the results we're getting, infiltrating the groundwater. Among other places in the water, as Chief Hope pointed out, it's not just about the groundwater either. It's about the land. As she said, and as I titled last week's episode, our people can't trust the land anymore. So it's not just about drinking water. This is about contamination of the environment, as far as I understand, from the First Nations of Nacho-Nayakdun's perspective. Now, Victoria Gold also released a press release. It didn't say, I would argue, that much. There's been some water testing. And so they did release, July 30th, the same day as the CBC interview, saying they're doing a seismic survey, water sampling daily. 7 of the 134 samples collected as of July 23rd, downstream of the heap leach facility incident in Haggart Creek, registered minor amounts of cyanide with concentrations ranging from 5.2 to 9.3. The water use license for cyanide is 5, so higher than what the water use license allows, almost double in the 9.3 parts per billion case. So they are breaking the water license as far as the levels, and they've registered, again, 7 of 134, according to their readings. And that was on July 23rd. They're also doing water treatment on site, and they're retaining multiple independent industry-leading experts to conduct a root cause analysis. In addition, the company is cooperating with third-party technical experts retained by the Yukon government and the First Nations of Nacho-Nayakdun. And as they say in the press release, production operations remain suspended. And they repeat, by the way, there can be no assurance that the company will receive authorizations necessary to restart production, or that the company will have the financial resources necessary to repair damage to equipment and facilities or remediate impacts caused by the incident or restart production. So they repeated that they may not be able to pay for the cleanup or to really deal with this situation. Going back to the CBC interview, CBC, the government has said it has hired some independent contractors that are going to go and build this berm, but you don't think that's what's needed on site. John McConnell, I wouldn't say it's what's needed. We just feel that there are some safety and environmental concerns at this time and that we wouldn't build it. So not really going into specifics here. CBC, is that good news contained in that update that went out this morning, or is there additional good news that you can share? So referring to that press release that we were just summarizing, John McConnell, no, I think that was generally good news. We're at a place where we're starting to treat water now and things are in much better control than they were 2 weeks ago. Now, again, this was released on July 30th, this interview, and so we didn't get any information that 2 weeks before that they were very concerned. There was no press release, in fact. It was July 12th, the last we heard, and there was no sense that they were losing sleep over the safety of the heap leach facility. Also in the interview, they brought people in from Texas to help treat the water. CBC, there are concerns that not enough is being done, that cyanide has already been released into the environment. What do you make of those concerns? John McConnell, it's still a concern of ours. We're not out of the woods yet. I think there's been some good positive steps, but there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of water to treat. I think we've been able to collect the majority of the water. There's no doubt that there is groundwater, which is very difficult to predict what happens to it and where it goes. There's still uncertainty, no doubt about that. We're doing about everything humanly possible to prevent this from becoming a major environmental disaster. So, again, I feel like we're getting mixed messages here. On one hand, they're saying we're disagreeing with the independent contractors from the Yukon government who are coming in with what they want to do. On the other hand, we can't necessarily afford to fix it, but on the other hand, we're doing everything we humanly can to prevent this from becoming a, quote, major environmental disaster. CBC, does that potential still exist, do you think? John McConnell, I think there's still potential for minor impacts, but no longer major impacts. CBC, and why are you confident about that? John McConnell, I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't be in this business. Not exactly very comforting. It's because I'm an optimist that I think that things are going to work out here. Not based on, again, specifics and facts on why he's confident. He continues, I think we've taken all the right steps to ensure that the impact on the environment is minimal. Again, very general. CBC also asks later on, can you tell me a little bit about these experts in this investigation that you mentioned? And CBC here is referring to the fact that Victoria Gold, as John McConnell mentions in the interview, appointed a panel of experts that are going to be doing an investigation on what happened. CBC asks about these experts and the investigation. And John McConnell answers, yeah, it's a panel of 3 people. 2 of them are experienced heap leach people, and 1 is a hydrochemist that's been involved in investigations like this in the past. We didn't put out their names because we didn't want people like you phoning them up and bothering them. We won't identify the individuals until at least their initial report is done. I mean, we won't identify the individuals? Like, are they allowed to do that? And why not? Because you don't want them to be bothered? Do you think the people in the First Nation of Nacho Nyack Dun want to be bothered by this environmental catastrophe, as they're calling it? Do you think they want to be bothered by that? I mean, the hostility here towards the press after really saying nothing for 5 weeks is remarkable. So finally, CBC asks about the finances. So what is Victoria Gold's financial situation right now? John McConnell. Yeah, we're fine. Our finances for the next 4 to 6 months, but at a certain point, we'll have to do a financing, but that'll come in time. So very confident that this will all resolve itself. Finally, CBC asks about the relationship with the First Nation of Nacho Nyack Dun. John McConnell. There's no doubt our relationship with NND is strained right now. However, I have met with the leadership since the incident. According to Chief Hope in our interview, he met once. I spent July 1st in Mayo. We are organizing a community meeting for later in August. And so I respect their opinions and the opinions of the experts, but I think the best thing for us to do is all work together. And finally, referring to some contractors who say they haven't been paid and are making small claims, John McConnell, we try and keep that to a minimum, and the best way to ensure all those people are completely made whole is to work with the First Nation and the Yukon government to put the mine back in production. So we're fine for the next 4 to 6 months for money, but we're not going to pay these people until the mine is put back into production, is the inference here. And then finally, CBC, are you worried at this point? Referring to the heap leach pad facility. John McConnell, of course I'm worried. I sleep better at night now than I did 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. Again, when we never got a press release saying, I'm terrified about what might happen. I need help. He continues, but as I said at the very beginning, we're not out of the woods yet and got a lot of work to do. So to editorialize, what happens when you don't communicate in a situation where the environment is getting contaminated? You start to lose credibility. And when you're telling people you couldn't even sleep well at night 2 or 3 weeks ago because of your concern, but you weren't informing anybody about anything, does this create credibility? And finally, some experts hired by the First Nation of Nacho Nyack Dun have told us there's simply not enough reagent on site or that Victoria Gold can get on site to treat all this water. It's just impossible. Is that true? John McConnell, no. CBC, Victoria Gold has all the adequate resources on site now to treat all the water that needs to be treated? John McConnell, that's correct, and we'll be looking at increasing the capacity to treat as well. CBC, and how will you be doing that? John McConnell, we're looking at another type of plant that could be installed, but it'll take some time to design and construct. CBC, will it be done by this season, or is this a more forward-looking plan? John McConnell, I think the best timeline would have it operational ahead of next spring's freshet. As far as I understand this article, John McConnell's saying we're going to have everything we need in place by next spring. Okay, so that is, a very kind of quick look at that CBC article. You can read the whole thing on CBC's website. We're not out of the woods. Victoria Gold CEO speaks publicly for the first time since heap leach failure. They also put out an article the following day, more than $43.3 million in small claims registered against Victoria Gold since heap leach failure. So it sounds like from this article, there is a suggestion that there are more than $43 million in unpaid bills. The premier, on the same day of the interview, Premier Ranj Pillai, speaking at the Council of Yukon First Nations, also shows up on the scene, who, according to this article, Ranj Pillai, the premier, suggested the company has joined a list of, quote, bad actors, end quote, that have exploited the territory. For Ranj Pillai, the premier, to say this 5 weeks later, Again, it's kind of like, where's the action here? I mean, if they're talking about building facilities to deal with the treated water next spring, everything seems to be moving in slow motion here. Ply also said, quote, industry cannot operate today if it's at tomorrow's expense. The future of Yukon is not for sale, end quote. Like, I find this all kind of sad. Again, if I was premier, I would try and visit the site. I would at least have been on site once. Probably be a good PR opportunity, frankly, that I care and I'm doing something about this. But I mean, 5 weeks later. So continuing on, the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun put out a press release, and this is on August 1st. And the headline, First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun has lost confidence in Victoria Gold's ability to respond to disaster at Eagle Gold Mine. So it seems to me this was a response to the interview. And it says as a subheadline, Victoria Gold lacks the financial resources to be entrusted with remediation of the environmental disaster at Yukon Mine. And it says here in the press release, the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun calls for steps to be taken to remove Victoria Gold Corporation's management from control of the work needed to remediate the heap leach disaster at the Eagle Gold Mine, which is located in the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun territory in the Yukon. The First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun urges the Yukon government to take immediate and robust action to ensure that the necessary work is being undertaken to remedy and prevent further harm from the significant and confirmed cyanide contamination that was caused by the heap leach pad failure at Victoria Gold's Eagle Gold Mine. First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun also reiterates its call for a full and independent inquiry under the Public Inquiries Act to examine the technical, regulatory, and legislative failures that caused this catastrophe and ensure it never happens again. And they have a quote from Chief Donna Hope. Quote, the reality is that Victoria Gold cannot rectify the environmental damage caused by this event. They have been failing to take the remediation actions directed by the Yukon government. Victoria Gold's apologies and the comments of their CEO in the media ring hollow and they ring false. The company has lost our confidence, and we do not believe they will be able to effectively address this disaster they created in our traditional territory. End quote. Chief Hope continued, quote, the Eagle Gold Mine disaster is a catastrophe that our nation will need to live with for decades, if not generations. And the cyanide contamination gets worse by the day. The First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun can no longer support this project or any further heap leach mining on our territory. The risks from heap leach mining are no longer acceptable in light of the damage already caused to our lands by this catastrophe. The simple fact is that Victoria Gold now lacks consent and social license. End quote. Well, what more needs to be said? And I mean, what does it mean when politicians at the start of their speech say that they are giving a speech on the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun, on the traditional territory and everything that goes along with that, but then they aren't listened to? Like, I don't understand. So Reuters reported on this press release as well. First Nation group in Yukon calls for change in Victoria Gold management. That's on mining.com. And so that is the latest on Victoria Gold. It continues here, and to editorialize here, my heart goes out to the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun, where they just want this fixed. They are pro-mining, and they just want this fixed. They just want action to be taken. The CEO makes a first interview after 5 weeks. The premier makes the first public speaking beyond, a text message and, answering a reporter's question. Here we are 5 weeks later. And not to be overly critical here, nobody's asking for a mine disaster to happen, but where's the premier? These generalities, like the future of Yukon is not for sale. Like, how about dealing with the situation immediately in front of us, the ongoing catastrophe? I don't think the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun, from my perspective, if it was me, I wouldn't want to hear about generalities on the future. I want to hear about what you're doing to solve this crisis now. And even the responses we're getting from John McConnell there, you see why the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun and Chief Hope want new management. It's kind of amazing that this continues to go on. To the government's credit, I will say this, the people they put in charge who were talking last week, they did seem to get the message. I'm not sure about the premier here. At least he did show up for the first time. But these protagonists in this play have shown up in what feels like very late in the drama. So again, that is your latest on Victoria Gold. Continuing on, just a quick update on the Congo. So this is voanews.com with a story from Agence France Presse. M23 rebels take Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda border town. That's August 4th. And apparently it went without a fight. So just a couple of lines here. Quote, Ishasha has passed without resistance under M23 control, end quote, civil society leader Romy Sawasawa told AFP. So it went without a fight. Congolese police officers had crossed into Uganda to flee the, quote, numerous and well-equipped, end quote, rebels. Someone's equipping the M23, that's for sure. So that continues, and Bloomberg put out a big opinion piece here from Justice Malala, a political commentator and former editor of South Africa's This Day and author. And here's the headline, Africa is heading towards another deadly war. Saber-rattling and armed clashes between the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, and others could see a repeat of the world's deadliest conflict since World War II. We've been tracking this conflict now for months here, at least since, I would say, early February, late January, and it seems to be intensifying. That came out on July 31st. Meanwhile, we have the South China Morning Post with a headline, Chinese firms start work on DRC road projects under renegotiated mining deal. And also a story coming out on newsecuritybeat.org, going beyond conflict-free, transition minerals governance in DRC and Rwanda. And really, this article, which I wish we had more time to go into, shows how the conflict, as it says here in a subheadline, conflict is entangled with mining. So that is your update on the wider world in our special summer feature here with Rick Rule on legendary newsletter writer James Dines. So a wonderful interview coming up this episode. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner, and on Instagram at The Northern Miner, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts, and wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to the news. And turning to the website, commodities face contagion as global market meltdown deepens. This was written yesterday. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Commodities from copper and gold to crude oil tumbled while paring back some of the losses as global economic malaise dimmed the outlook for industrial demand and sent traders rushing to cash out of profitable positions. Copper settled down 1.8% on the London Metal Exchange after slumping as much as 3.8%, with aluminum also falling. Benchmark oil futures dropped about 0.5% after trading down 2.3% at the lowest level in 7 months. Raw material markets were dragged into a massive sell-off on Monday as investors reacted to U.S. data signaling a deterioration in the world's biggest economy and speculation that Federal Reserve's long-awaited pivot to more supportive monetary policy may come too late to prevent a major downturn in the U.S. and beyond. The sell-off tapered after fresh data showed the U.S. services sector expanded in July. Quote, it's just a widespread panic, end quote, said Phil Streibel, chief market strategist at Blue Line Futures. Quote, we've had record amounts of cash sitting on the sidelines, end quote, with bargain hunters taking advantage of lower prices. And we also heard from Matthew Schwab, head of investor solutions at Quantix Commodities, quote, markets like oil and copper appear to be pricing in a recession, which equity and bond markets are doing as well. Still, some agriculture markets, such as soybeans and cocoa, rose on Monday. And one more quote here. This is Ryan Fitzmaurice, a senior commodities strategist at Merrick's. Quote, commodities are getting hit by this risk-off event, but looking out on the horizon, a weaker U.S. dollar and rate cuts could provide support for the asset class. Another headline, and this is on the election of the new Secretary General of the International Seabed Authority. Here's the headline, a fraught election just reshaped the next steps for deep-sea mining. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. A Brazilian oceanographer has been elected the next Secretary General of the International Seabed Authority, a leadership change that could slow the rush to strip mine deep-sea ecosystems for electric vehicle battery metals. When Leticia Carvalho takes office on January 1st, she'll become the first woman and first scientist to helm the United Nations-affiliated organization responsible for the fate of 54% of the world's seabed. A former environmental regulator in Brazil, Carvalho 50 currently serves as an official at the UN Environment Program in Nairobi. Scrolling down, the vote by ISA member states, which came down to 79 to 34 for Carvalho, also follows a contentious election campaign. It was marked by accusations that a key Lodge supporter, and Michael Lodge being the other main contestant in the election, it was marked by accusations that a key Lodge supporter tried to bribe Carvalho to drop out of the race in exchange for a top job at the ISA. Quite an allegation here. In an interview last month, Carvalho told Bloomberg Green that as Secretary General, she would focus on science and act as a neutral administrator of the ISA, which includes 169 member states and the European Union. Quote, transparency and accountability is my top priority, end quote, Carvalho said. Now, fascinatingly, Financial Times put out a profile the day before on this election. And remember the BBC article that I was reading for regular listeners on this idea of dark oxygen? It came up again here on this ISA election article in the Financial Times. And here it is. A new dimension in the process is the, quote, dark oxygen, end quote, finding that an electrical charge associated with metallic nodules on the sunlight-deprived seafloor can split water into its constituent elements, hydrogen and oxygen. It had previously been thought that the gas in the oceans came solely from organisms that, as on land, use light to turn carbon dioxide into oxygen through photosynthesis. So it's this idea that these metals in the deep sea are actually helping split water into constituent elements, hydrogen and oxygen. And we have a quote from Murray Roberts, a professor of marine biology at the University of Edinburgh, who said on social media, quote, I think this is the biggest paradigm shift in deep science I've ever seen, end quote. TMC, the mining company, which is trying to mine in the deep sea, has issued a forceful rebuttal claiming that other journals had refused to publish the paper and that the samples were contaminated by seawater. It said rival papers had found net oxygen consumption rather than production on the seabed. The researchers issued an equally strong defense of the work. Since publication, they had been contacted by other scientists who had found similar data but had not believed it, said Professor Andrew Sweetman, leader of the research. Quote, my co-authors and I stand fully behind the findings in this research paper. We would welcome future peer-reviewed studies that further investigate this phenomenon, end quote. So deep sea mining continues to be hugely controversial here. Let's continue on, moving over to Chile. BHP has requested state mediation with Escondida Union in Chile. This is Reuters via mining.com. Australian miner BHP has requested mediation by the Chilean government with the union representing workers at its Escondida mine. The company said on Monday, a move aimed at avoiding a potential strike at the world's largest copper project. BHP noted in a statement that the mine is operating normally and that the mediation would aim to achieve a contractual agreement for the mine's workers. BHP owns more than half of Escondida, while Rio Tinto and Geco Corp control minority stakes. Once the mediation is confirmed, the parties will have 5 working days to continue negotiations, according to the statement. Last week, Escondida workers rejected an offer for a new collective bargaining agreement, according to the union. The union has demanded that 1% of dividends be distributed equally among workers, but declined on Monday to comment on the company's request for mediation. Continuing in Chile, Codelco working very hard to boost copper output, CEO says. So, of course, the new CEO of Codelco under immense pressure to boost output at this aging mine. This is Reuters via mining.com. Chile's state-run Codelco is working very hard to recover its copper production level, CEO Ruben Alvarado said on Tuesday as the copper giant grapples with a 25-year low in output. Codelco registered an 8.4% drop in production in the first half of the year, but is targeting a turnaround in the coming months to end 2024 slightly above last year. And here is the quote from Alvarado. Quote, we are working very hard on this. We have a plan through 2030 to progressively recover production until reaching 1.7 million tons, end quote, annually, he told Reuters during a visit to the company's operations center in Rancagua, south of the capital of Santiago. So very interesting there, and an update on the controversy between Tanchi and SQM and Codelco regarding this lithium deal. Chilean court rejects Tanchi's request to pause SQM-Codelco deal. This is Reuters via mining.com. A Chilean court has rejected a request from China's Tanchi Lithium to pause a planned partnership between state-run Codelco and lithium miner SQM, as the court analyzes arguments against the deal, according to a court document dated Thursday. Tanchi, which owns a fifth of SQM, is challenging the financial regulator's decision to allow the joint venture to move forward without a vote by shareholders, and last week asked an appeals court to suspend the regulator's resolution while analyzing the matter. SQM and Tianqi declined to comment. So it continues over there. Continuing on, EnergyX makes a $150 million bid for Gallon Lithium's Argentina assets. This is Reuters via mining.com. So just a headline there, but maybe companies taking advantage of the low prices in lithium right now. And another headline here, Endeavor's ex-CEO paid miner $1.35 million settlement after firing. Bloomberg News via mining.com. Endeavor Mining said its former chief executive officer paid the firm $1.35 million in a settlement months after the gold miner fired him for alleged serious misconduct. The London-listed company removed Sébastien de Montessus in January amid a probe into an irregular payment of $5.9 million made at the instruction of the then CEO. Continuing on, Glencore to pay a $152 million fine in bribery case. This is by a staff writer at mining.com. Glencore has been fined $152 million by Swiss authorities for failing to prevent a business partner from bribing a Congolese public official in 2011. In a statement released on Monday, the Swiss Attorney General's office said that prosecutors determined Glencore did not take sufficient measures to prevent the bribery. Continuing on, MP Materials lost steeper than expected on low rare earth prices. This is Reuters via mining.com. U.S. rare earth producer MP Materials on Thursday reported a steeper than expected second quarter loss due to falling prices for the strategic minerals and operational challenges, although executives forecast a rebound for later this year. The company, which held unsuccessful merger talks this year with rival Lynas Rare Earths, has struggled in recent months with falling prices and stiff competition from Chinese rivals. And finally, Solvay to supply Europe with rare earth metals to reduce reliance on China. This is Reuters via mining.com. Belgian chemicals group Solvay aims to supply Europe with rare earth permanent magnets used in EVs and wind turbines from its refurbished plant in France. To help the continent reduce reliance on China, the company said. The group confirmed regular production at the plant in La Rochelle should start in early 2025 and said it aimed to meet 30% of Europe's needs for permanent magnets by 2030. It is the only facility in Europe able to process light and heavy rare earth materials at an industrial level. And here is CEO Philippe Caron, who told Reuters, quote, "The goal is to supply all of Europe with rare earth metals made in La Rochelle," end quote. So very ambitious plans from Solvay. Those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 3.89%. That is 0.29% lower than last week. So big fall in yields, of course, on fears in financial markets. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 3.9%. That is down 0.17% from last week. And the Italy 10-year bond is yielding 3.67%, and that is only down 0.04% from last week. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $2,445.80 per ounce. That is $57 higher than last week. So gold up on the week, performing quite well, I might add. It seemed like not a bad place to be at all. Silver, another story. It is trading at $26.96 per ounce. That is $1.17 lower than last week. Platinum is trading at $909.40 per ounce. That is $42 lower than last week. And palladium is also lower at $825 even. That is $57 lower than last week. So quite a low price there in palladium at $825 per ounce. Turning to industrial metals, copper back below $4 at $3.98 per pound. That is 8 cents lower than last week. Iron ore is at $104 even per metric ton. That is $2.86 lower than last week. Aluminum is unchanged at $1.02 per pound. Lead is lower at 89 cents per pound. That is 5 cents lower than last week. Nickel is higher at $7.35 per pound. That is 12 cents higher than last week. So maybe it just couldn't get any lower with nickel there. Interesting move. Tin is also higher at $13.69 per pound. That is 28 cents higher than last week. Cobalt is lower at $12.02 per pound. That is 6 cents lower than last week. Lithium is at $11.17 per kilogram. That is 61 cents lower than last week and threatening the $11 handle there on lithium. One wonders if we're going to start seeing a little bit of M&A as lithium prices continue to crash. Uranium is trading at $82.60 per pound. Almost even, that is 15 cents higher than last week, and zinc is trading at $1.20 per pound. That is unchanged from last week. So gold, a huge standout here, up on the week, and also we have to give credit to nickel and tin, which were higher for the week. Otherwise, markets moving mostly in unison on macroeconomic headwinds, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the program Rick Rule, CEO of Rule Investment Media. And on this very special summer feature, we discussed legendary newsletter writer James Dines and Rick Rule's firsthand experience knowing the man. Of course, James Dines passed in 2022. James Dines is the reason I'm talking to you right now through this microphone, because I subscribed to his letter back in 2009, 2010, jumped on the rare earths bubble, and began a journey that led me to the Northern Miner. And I've always just been a huge fan of James Dines' work and really, as I mentioned in this interview, really original, creative thinking. In some respects, a very inspirational figure. I hope you enjoy the interview, and I will see you on the other side. Joining us today, I am very pleased to welcome to the show Rick Rule, CEO of Rule Media, investor, speculator, and 4-decade subscriber to the Northern Miner. Rick, welcome back. I'm so thrilled to have you back.
Pleasure. I'm delighted to be back. I've gotten a lot of benefit from the Miner over these decades.
Well, it's great to hear. And of course, you have been in this industry for decades. And I asked you to be on the show because you have a firsthand experience, as I learned the last time we talked, of the great, often called legendary, the original gold bug, James Dines. The person who really introduced me to this business when I came across his website with rare earths on it and the Dines letter. And for the first time in my life, I jumped off a cliff and spent the $500 approximately that it cost me to subscribe. And sure enough, then the rare earths took off within a few months. All to say, some people may not know who he is. Other listeners will be very familiar. Who was James Dines?
Well, for me, he was a friend. I was blessed to know him until his death for the better part of 4 decades. He was a larger-than-life guy, almost a showbiz personality. He would go to these stodgy old mining conference banquets in a leather tuxedo, stuff like that. And he was a very, very, very smart guy. His discipline was very different than mine. He was attracted to the study of mass psychology, and I'm unconversant with mass psychology. I don't own a TV, as an example. And he was attracted to technical analysis, almost statistical observation of mass psychology. I was attracted, by contrast, to fundamental analysis and credit analysis. What amused the both of us is that we often took very different paths to come to the same conclusion. He would look for markets that were sold out, distressed, and disgusted, but in a stealth upturn. I would look for the same type of market where the selling had been exhausted and the shares were too cheap. So our route to the conclusion was very different, but our conclusions were often the same. He was a wonderful self-promoter. He was the original blank bug on anything he was promoting at the time. It could be gold, it could be silver, it could be rare earths, it could be Bitcoin. Didn't matter much. He was the original internet bug, had you have asked him. And while that self-promotion could, occasionally become tedious, it was just part of his larger-than-life personality. It's probably politically incorrect to mention it, too, but James Dines liked pretty girls, and he knew that the rest of the world liked pretty girls. If you saw his booth, the Dines booth, at any of the conferences in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, his booth was populated by himself and between 2 and 4 very polite, very smart, very attractive young women, which meant that irrespective of the political sensibilities of the crowd, that his booth was always the most crowded at any conference that you could go to. Again, part of his larger-than-life personality and part of his understanding of the mass psychology, at least, of the audience that he was speaking to.
It rings true from those newsletters I read when I subscribed back in, I guess, 2010. And yeah, his big focus on mass psychology, I mean, it was fascinating. And I guess he was considered a pioneer of what he called visual analysis, I think really significantly with his technical analysis, as you were mentioning. So kind of interestingly, I mean, almost zooming out from the investment side of things, I mean, I get the sense, he put out the book, The Secrets of High States. He was kind of, I mean, and you knew him personally, like my impression was this guy is a kind of philosopher of sorts, and investing was just one part of this larger approach to the world. Is that a fair assessment in your opinion?
Absolutely true. Politically and philosophically, he was libertarian. So he and I were in complete concurrence there. I guess his preference in terms of society would probably be described as progressive, which is to say the causes that he cared about were very people-centric. But his philosophy was that one person's right could not create an obligation on another. In that sense, he was very much a philosopher. He was also, as you suggest, interested in non-political philosophy. He was interested in religion, although he wasn't religious. And he was an absolutely superb photographer. I bought some of his photographs, and I, of course, bought his book, which was a collection of his own photographs. And I used to love to hang out in his gallery, his photo gallery in Mill Valley, California. So, yeah, he was in all kinds of ways an accomplished and interested human being in a variety of areas. But I have to say, I think his best contributions were commercial. I think he did original work around behavioral finance, work that benefited me directly.
Super interesting. I mean, he would have all of these like acronyms and, talking about paradox and everything. Like he was a very creative thinker. I came as basically an artist across his work, and I was just like, there's so much food for thought here, so much creativity. And he was a great speaker, like from what I could hear just on interviews, whether it was King World News at the time or Financial Sense News Hour, all the hits, of the podcast world. One thing I think is worth emphasizing before I get into really how you met him is the positivity. Like it came out in almost every word. He had a certain way of speaking that was almost hypnotic, incredibly charismatic. Can you speak at all about the positivity of James Dines?
Well, I think that anybody who has succeeded to the extent that he did is positive. If you aren't positive, if you're negative, you find a whole bunch of reasons why you can't succeed. And Jim was never interested in those. Sort of like the old Agora copywriter, the world is going to end on Thursday, and here's how you can profit. As to his acronyms and his speaking style, Jim understood that slogans and icons allow people through imagery to understand a concept better. And so Jim's topic sentence around some subject was always a slogan that people could remember. He would then spend 3 or 4 paragraphs establishing and defending the paradigm. But he was always generous to the listener or viewer in the sense that he paid real attention to how he could cause the thought to easily become codified in his audience's mind. The success of that, I think, was really the success of the letter. Because if you looked at the paradigm which was believed in the newsletter publishing business at that time, it was that less is more, that you could say anything that you wanted as long as the audience believed it to be usable, and it could be said in 75 words or less. The trend was very much like USA Today, not say very much, but say it brief. And Dine's letters were often 20 pages long. They often strayed far from investments. But the very success of the letter had to do with the fact that he identified an audience that, while they understood that his slogans were useful, was really much more interested in his way of thinking and his content. He, I think, partially as a function of his personality, much like Richard Russell, by the way, developed a cult following, a group of people who read the letter for their own profit, yes, but for their amusement, too. And I think that goes a lot to the legend that James Dines sort of occupies today. There aren't many people today who do what he did, at least not very many who did it successfully. The idea that he could attract as a paid subscriber an artist in the hard money community, probably in reflection, says it all.
I agree. I mean, there I was reading, J.G. Ballard books, and I was like, who is James Dines? So just very briefly, because I want to get into more your personal relationship with him and how you met him, but you mentioned Richard Russell and newsletter rating, and of course, he was famous for the Dines letter, I would argue, probably primarily among his other great books that he wrote, Goldbug and others, Mass Psychology. What did he represent very briefly in the newsletter world? When did you discover it? And what did he represent from your perspective in newsletters? He seemed like a pioneer is kind of where I'm getting to here.
I think he was a pioneer. I think the real pioneers of that era were Doug Casey, a personality-based letter, Richard Russell, a personality-based letter, and James Dine, a personality-based letter. They all, at various times, strayed very far from conventional publishing. They all, from time to time, offered, as I do, absolute gold-plated money-back guarantee. If you aren't satisfied with the product, simply tell us, we'll give you your money back. They all had personality and unique points of view. And they all had letters that varied very, very substantially from the so-called Phillips formula, which is to say, short, to the point, believed to be actionable. Don't bother justifying your opinion, because the fact that the audience is there means that they already have established the validity of the opinion. All three of those writers, the ones that I consider to be the icons, were very interested in having people understand how their opinions were formed, so that people who adopted their ideas would adopt them honestly. None of them ever enjoyed the really truly broad circulation that things like personal finance enjoyed in those days. But they all had very, very, very high renewal rates. Richard Russell's renewal rates were well over 90% in an industry where the median renewal rate was probably more like 25 or 30, which meant that there was an audience that really didn't like being told what to do so much as how to do it, and an audience, too, that sympathized or perhaps empathized with the forceful character that came through in their publications.
Very interesting to hear your view. Now, how did you meet James Dines? How did that all happen? I assume you first saw the newsletter and then maybe you went to a conference and met him. How did you become friends with James Dines?
Yeah, it was common in the late 70s and early 80s when a newsletter recommended a company that the company would pirate excerpts from the newsletter, usually without permission, and send them out to people who they hoped to induce to buy the stock. And Mr. Dines first came to my attention as a consequence of what I suspect was pirated copy. That pirated copy was interesting enough to me that I either wrote or called the Sausalito office and got a copy of the letter, read it, and got immediately fascinated with it. Now, this would have been in the late 70s. In the mid-80s, I had occasion to speak at the New Orleans Investment Conference, and I spoke right before Jim Dines. And when I came off stage back into the speaker lounge, he was getting ready to go up on stage. And he said, hang around for my talk and then let's go for coffee. I want to visit with you. I don't remember what year that is, to be honest with you, but it would have been in the late 1980s. And after that, we became very fast friends. We always took the time to have a meal together in New Orleans. And we also always took the time to have a meal together around the old San Francisco Gold Show. Him living across the bridge, depending on the time, in Belvedere or Sausalito or Mill Valley. We always took the time at those two conferences to spend time together. When I was in the Bay Area and when I had time, I loved to go across the bridge into Sausalito or Mill Valley or wherever he happened to be and just hang out with him.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. Like, as far as you feel comfortable to say, I mean, what was it like to hang out with James Dines? I imagine it wasn't just like, your average hangout, like I imagine there's all sorts of kind of maybe unusual aspects about it. I mean, what was it like to hang out with James Dines?
Interestingly, I guess, interesting to me, the best time to hang out with him was when he was exhausted because he was a performer. There was a whole act, a whole shtick around James Dines. And that could get fairly tiresome. But on a couple of occasions, I had lunches with him when he was absolutely exhausted. And then all of the shtick went away. And you were left with a very nice, very interesting human being. And then, of course, the other thing that I enjoyed with him personally was him explaining to me how he did photography. What photography meant to him, how he composed pictures, why he chose certain pictures for his book and not others. I have absolutely no aesthetic skills personally. I know when I see something, whether I like it aesthetically, but I have no ability to dress myself, no ability to visualize a finished house from a plan, no ability to compose music or do any art. He had all of those abilities, and it interested him to explain the organization of aesthetics to somebody like me who had no talent but a lot of interest in it. And I really enjoyed the fact that that interested him. And I think he probably enjoyed the fact that it interested me.
Very interesting. And just in terms of, if you can speak about this, and no problem if you can't, like, did he have family? I mean, there's not really much. Obviously, when he passed, there was a write-up on the internet. So clearly there's some family. But did he have immediate family? Did he ever get married? Did he have kids?
He was married. I spoke to him about that once. His response was sharp enough and hostile enough that I never revisited the topic again. So I imagine that the breakup was very unpleasant. I don't know.
Yeah, he seemed to be a very private man, which is why I, qualify my question with, what you can discuss. So very good. So how did he influence you as a thinker? Like, what was, or if you have any anecdotes as well, if we have time for that, was there any special anecdote that you'd like to tell us? Like, what was one of the kind of big events that maybe happened when you guys were hanging out?
Well, certainly the two circumstances that drew us the closest was his early adoption of the uranium thesis from a mass society and a technical analysis point of view, which coincided with my own attraction to the uranium thesis for fundamental reasons. And then a discussion that we had in conjunction with a guy named John Kaiser around rare earths, where Dines was explaining to me, I think Kaiser got it already, but Dines was explaining to me how the rare earth thesis, how the rare earth narrative would appeal not only to resource investors, but also to technology and generalist investors, and why, as a theme around small speculative stocks, that the rare earth thesis had real legs. They seemed like minor markets themselves, like treacherous markets, like markets that were so small that you couldn't make money in them over time. And Dines wasn't particularly interested in over time. He was a trader. What he was interested in was something that was deeply out of favor, that would return to favor, where you would make money when it simply wasn't hated, and then make a lot more money when the narrative was adopted by the broader populace. I think in terms of his contribution to my own way of thinking in investments, it was that because he could explain to me that market reactions were in the near term much less tied to fundamentals than they were for me. He taught me, after I had taken my initial capital off the table, to be willing to let my profits run, because my sense of the value of a company had nothing to do with where its price could go if the narrative became broadly accepted. There were rare earth companies that ran from 25 cents a share to $1 a share, and then to $5 a share and $6 a share and $7 a share, and ultimately to zero. What Dines was interested in was the progression from unknown, boring, or hated to loved. That's what the book Mass Psychology, which I suspect was his magnum opus, was really all about.
So fascinating, Rick. And, what was also so interesting was he adopted and embraced things like crypto, whether it was internet stocks, as you said earlier, the original, blank bug of, whatever the case might be. I mean, I remember it was in August 2020. I'd been hearing about crypto, it was really creeping up on my YouTube. But it was when I heard, I think one of the last interviews with James Dines, who's like, no, you got to buy Bitcoin and Ethereum, that I was like, oh, okay, I actually need to find out how to do this. So not an ideologue, so to speak.
I would say he was an ideologue. I would say a lot of what he liked about crypto goes back to his libertarian philosophy. He wanted a medium of exchange that was a people's medium of exchange, a medium of exchange that wasn't controlled by the governments, wasn't controlled by the central banks, wasn't controlled by big thinkers, a medium of exchange that was anonymous and peer-to-peer. And I think he understood instinctively that there was enough interest in that itself that the momentum around the investment could be ideological, and that once that momentum was established, that the narrative would cause the investment performance to exceed almost anybody's expectation. He was very good at that kind of thing.
Indeed, letting your profits run, as you were saying earlier. So as we wrap up here then, Rick, any final thoughts on James Dines that we haven't discussed here that you think that we should mention?
I don't know, other than, for your readers and listeners' benefits, I think your relationship with advice can become much more profitable if you are able to identify with the person giving you the advice. Had I not understood the sort of zeitgeist of Jim Dines, his admonitions about narrative and momentum, about mass psychology, probably wouldn't have played well with a credit analyst like myself. I had to come to appreciate the guy before I came to appreciate the advice. And I suspect that consumers of advice, which are people that are listening to this podcast, would probably do well to spend a bit more time choosing advisors, particularly advisors they're going to pay for.
Hard to disagree with. So thank you again, Rick, for all your time. Now, you have a virtual boot camp coming up here on August 24th. Tell the audience a little bit about what you're up to and maybe how they can become involved.
4 times a year, we do a very deep dive into some aspect of natural resource investing. We've done royalty and streaming companies. We've done uranium. We've done silver. We've done exploration and prospect generation. The upcoming one is basically an 8-hour deep dive into private placement investing. It's mostly of use to people who are accredited investors. We will allow aspiring accredited investors, but it's much more useful to people who can implement the strategies. We will talk about equity private placements. We'll talk about debt private placements. We'll talk about private company private placements, pre-public private placements, PIPEs, which is to say aftermarket private placements. Talk about how to do them, how to analyze them, what the pitfalls are, what to look out for, how to access deal flow. Understand that this is 8 hours of very, very intentional and intensive programming. This is not an entertainment product, because we will present more material to our subscribers in 8 hours than they can absorb for 8 hours. The transcripts, the recordings will be available for the balance of 2024, and people will have to access them because we'll give people more information than they could absorb. The charge is $99. Like every other educational product from Rural Investment Media, it comes with a gold-plated money-back guarantee. If you pay to attend, you attend. And afterwards, don't believe that you got your $99 worth, email us, we'll give you the money back. No questions asked. If we fail, we would appreciate it if you told us how we could serve you better. But there's an absolute gold-plated money-back guarantee. As I say, this is suitable for people who really want to work because it's very, very, very intensive. This is not entertainment programming. This is educational programming. And if I might, I'd like to talk about a free product that I have. Any of your listeners who care what I have to say about natural resource investing can go to my website, ruralinvestmentmedia.com, and we'll personalize it for no charge, no obligation. List your natural resource stocks, and I personally will rank them 1 to 10, 1 being best, 10 being worst. And I'll comment on individual issues if I think my comments have any value. That's ruralinvestmentmedia.com.
Incredible. It sounds like a very valuable, actionable service that you're offering here, Rick. So thank you for joining us today. And I really appreciate you in the middle of summer here talking about your good friend, James Dines, one of my heroes, just a fascinating character. And thank you just for sharing your experience of him. And again, good luck with the virtual boot camp on August 24th. Thank you once again, Rick Rule, CEO of Rural Investment Media, investor and speculator, for joining us on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Thank you for the ability to talk about an old good friend.
Thank you once again to Rick Rule for being so generous with his time. And thank you, dear listener, for taking the time to listen to this program. I am doing everything I can to bring you value here each and every week. I hope you're having a wonderful summer as we enter the dog days of summer here, and that you are getting out in the sun and enjoying your time. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory. Share it with your friends. And until next week, take care.